there's a party after this, like a party after this. But this is the last session of the first in-person or hybrid day of the 10th Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health Disparities Symposium. So thanks so much for being here. I'm Rebecca Rear. I'm the Director of Climate Policy and Justice at the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. And yes, the rumors are true. I was Dr. Wilson's first mentee here in Maryland. And so thank you. I don't know if that's for me or Dr. Wilson, but thank you so much. And it's truly a humbling experience to have been his student. I'm at the age where I'm just not going to mention how many years ago that was at this point. But I've just entered that age where we're just going to say it was in the past. And it's truly humbling to have worked under him as a student and to have been a part of his research and starting here at the university and now being up on stage with all of you here today. It's really quite a journey, and appreciate Dr. Wilson's mentorship and everything that he has done here at the university and built up environmental justice and health research and research activism here in Maryland. So just want to say a big thanks to Dr. Wilson and his team for putting on this symposium and really celebrating the 10th one. So with that, I am humbled to serve as your moderator for this evening, for this panel, which is Legislative Efforts to Advance Environmental, Climate, and Energy Justice in Maryland. We did, Delegate Taveras, who you see on the agenda, was called away last minute for a different, actually the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce meeting. So she sent in a video that we're going to play for everyone to kick off this panel, and then we will get started with our elected officials who are here with us today.
Hi, I'm Maryland State Delegate Denny Taveras from the proud district of 47B in Prince George's County. And I want to say thank you to Rebecca and Professor Wilson for putting again this amazing symposium as they do every year. It's a pleasure to work with you all. And I unfortunately cannot be with you all today, but I felt so strongly that I needed to provide this video to discuss what was Bill HB 842 last year, which was called Justice 40. The Justice 40 bill was a mandate that was provided by President Biden under to ensure that all monies, 40% of the monies put forth from any federal agency, 40% of that is invested in communities of color that have historically been disenfranchised and neglected. And we want to make sure that there are tangible improvements, environmental improvements in these communities. And right now, in order for that to happen, we need to have a benchmark. We need to know where we are to then measure where we will end up. And we need to be able to have that measurable gap and measure that improvement. For example, the regional director for Region 3 at EPA, Adam Ortiz, who is also a Prince Georgian, was able to provide a report card, the best report card on the Chesapeake Bay for the first time in 20 years. That's measurable. We want to be able to, the same way we're passionate about Chesapeake Bay, the same way we should be as passionate in communities of color and have it be measurable. So if we're going to be investing billions of dollars in the state of Maryland, we need to know that we're getting a bang for our buck. And so we have a lot of colleagues that are there before you who are amazing colleagues that work in this space with me. And similarly, we want to be able to come together and work together to get this bill across the aisle. So now, what does that mean? That means that right now we have agencies, because we have a deficit in the state of Maryland, agencies want to spend the money the way they see fit because they got shovel-ready projects. I understand that. We understand that. But we want to make sure that by meeting those projects, it also meets the needs of those, or at least 40% of that money meets the needs of those least among us and most vulnerable amongst us. So that's the conversation that we need to have. It may result in a bill, it may not, but the thing is that the end result must be accountable, it must be enforceable, it must be tangible and measurable. And that's the key. That's what I want to bring to the table. And that's what I want us all to commit to today. And once we commit to this, we want to be able to advocate for this. Because where can you step in? That's your role. Your role is to come in, advocate to your representatives, write the letters, the petitions, come out for Advocacy Day, because for every one of you that steps into your representative's door, you represent hundreds of people. And that's power in your hands. And ask them outright, are you willing to support this bill? And because of that, I want to say we need to make sure that you are active in this process, just as we are active in preparing this bill. And once we are ready for it, we will be sharing it with you so that you guys could also comment and bring it to the table. So I want to say thank you to everyone for who's made it out there, to my colleagues for coming out, and just it's been an honor and a pleasure to be with you today and to share my ideas. So thank you so much, and may you all be blessed.
So thank you so much, Delegate Taveras. I know she was really bummed that she couldn't make it. So she sent that video, and we really appreciate her work on Justice 40 legislation for here in the state of Maryland. And so with that, I want to invite up the elected officials who are here this evening and give a very warm welcome to Senator Clarence Lamb, representing, is it Dr. Senator? District 12, which is Baltimore and Howard County, a member of the Finance Committee in the Senate. Thank you for being here. We also have Delegate Regina T. Boyce, who is from District 43 in Baltimore City, and the Vice Chair of the Environment and Transportation Committee in the House, and Delegate David Fraser Hidalgo, who is representing District 15, which is in Montgomery County, and is a member of the Economic Matters Committee in the House, which covers energy issues. So please join me in a warm welcome for our panel this evening. So I wanted to start by asking you to introduce yourselves. We have folks in the room, and we also have folks joining us online. Thank you so much for being here this evening. And just start opening remarks, a couple minutes to introduce yourselves and your experiences addressing environmental and climate injustice. Senator Lamb.
All right, good. All right, we'll have to talk loud. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Clarence Lamb, Senator in District 12, which is Howard and Anne Arundel counties. And, I've had the fortune, or misfortune, we served on the committee before, Environment and Transportation, when I was in the House, and then previously had served on the Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee when I was in the Senate in my first term. And so bring that background and kind of experience, having worked on a lot of environmental justice legislation, really environmental advocacy legislation as well, and also bring that perspective as a physician. So I'm a physician on faculty at Johns Hopkins, where I specialize in preventive medicine. Preventive medicine is especially of public health. And so really kind of wearing that frame and hat of environmental health and how the environment really does affect our health, because I think all too often, and I think what I have tried to advocate for all folks like yourself, when you're out there and talking to your communities, talking to constituents, talking to others about how important the environment is, to also link that to people's health. Because I think that really helps hit home for many folks, that when you hear about things like, glaciers pulling back or rainforests being destroyed in the Amazon, it seems very abstract to a lot of folks. But when you bring it home and realize that for the first time in like 40 years, we had our first case of malaria in Maryland last year. When you see instances where off the west coast of Mexico last year, hurricanes go from category 1 to category 5 in the span of 48 hours. And when you see, states like Arizona and Colorado having to negotiate over water, it hits home. It hits home because it means that, and when you see instances like Tony Fauci from the NIH, having a mosquito-borne virus that he contracted here in Maryland, it's because the environment is changing. It's because the tropics are moving upwards and northwards. And so it's instances like that you can point to that really helps people understand that it's not just the abstract, that the environmental changes that we see, that climate change is obviously real, and the environmental changes that we see impact us in our daily lives, whether it's through water that we drink, the food that we have access to, infectious diseases that we wouldn't ordinarily see here in the state of Maryland. And that really helps people understand why these issues, why the issues that you care about and that you work on are so incredibly important, because it makes it hit home to folks. And so I just want to kind of bring that home, and having brought that perspective to the General Assembly, have worked on things like cumulative impacts. I've served on the state's Environmental Justice and Sustainability Commission, understand that there's certainly a health equity issue when it comes to environmental justice as well, that it's no coincidence that some of these most polluting facilities and sites are located close to impoverished communities that need resources. And it's through discussions like this that we're able to continue working and advocating towards better equity across our communities and across our state. So look forward to this conversation. Why don't I stop there and pass along to Delegate David Frazier Hidalgo.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for having us here. Rebecca, thank you very much for inviting us. So my name is David Frazier Hidalgo. I'm a delegate from District 15, which is Montgomery County, northwestern Montgomery County. I have been a delegate for 11 years now, and I have served with both of these wonderful people on the stage with me, and Rebecca too. Rebecca and I have gone way, 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 way back. So I wanted to just kind of start off by saying that 9 years on the Environment and Transportation Committee, and 2.5 years now on economic matters. And the difference in subject matter is significant. And when I was on ENT with both Regina and with Clarence, we focused a lot on what's right in front of us on environmental issues, right? It was everything from the ban on fracking, which we worked on together, actually all three of us worked on together, to agriculture, to stormwater management, to everything in between that I know that Regina will be talking in great detail about. And going over to economic matters is interesting because that's all energy policy. So everything on economic matters is energy policy. And it's been very fascinating for me for the last couple of years to see energy policy from outside the committee and then to see energy policy from inside the committee. And then seeing how much of environmental policy, to what Senator Lamb was saying, is all connected. All of this is all connected. You can't say one thing without finding a way to connect it to climate change, when you connect it to resilience, when you connect it to impoverished communities where you see these things pop up in many ways first. It's all connected. And so when I went over to economic matters, where it's all climate, where it's all energy policy, you can see it in the energy policy, right? You can see it in where the coal-fired power plants are located. You can see it in a lot of other ways. But one of the things that I didn't realize was that I was going to be on one of the insurance committees, and going on to the insurance committees, like I said, it's all connected. So you go to property and casualty insurance, and you see. In some states, insurance isn't being offered anymore because of climate change. I mean, my house just got slammed with a hailstorm for the very first time the other day, and I may end up needing to put a new roof on my house. Never had that before. We never had that issue, to undersized gutters and undersized downspouts. So all of that starts to deal with insurance. Now it's in the insurance markets, which we deal with on economic matters. So I look forward to a very robust discussion when we get deeper into policy on this, but that's kind of a little bit of a background of me.
Good evening. I'm Regina T. Boyce, a state delegate from Baltimore City, District 43A. I'm always say, if you know where Morgan is and Hopkins and Notre Dame and Loyola, I like to point out the schools. That's a good roundabout area of where I represent. I think I'm the baby of the group. I was elected in 2019 and always had a personal, before being elected, had personal, I guess, environmental justice or environmental loves. You know, I'm the only person composting and nobody wants to come to my house because they don't know where to put anything. Or from a community level, when we had recycling in the city, you had to buy the recycling bin. And so no one on my block had it. I got a grant and got everybody the bin, because at the end of the day, I think people just wanted the bin, for instance. And so give them the paper. If I give you this paper, I give you this bin. Will you recycle? Yes. So you go from essentially just poor little Regina recycling to everybody on the block recycling. And so I think something, I want to kind of hone in on what Dr. Senator Lamb said, is that sometimes with this work, we have to make it practical and drive it home to make it make sense for somebody who doesn't see the bigger picture. When we say rising sea levels, it's like, well, that don't have nothing to do with me. But then when you think about places in my community where for 50 years, one section of my community has flooded to the point where, you know, insurance companies, to Delegate Frager-Dago's point, either are not insuring anymore, or we have to start from an environmental justice or a climate justice point of view, have to look at how we build houses, where we build houses. Most houses now aren't going to have basements, for instance, because of low-level flooding or infrastructure issues. And so I have been on the Environment and Transportation Committee since I was elected in 2019, and I've only been the vice chair for a year, but I've been on pretty much every subcommittee. And just in general, with work that I've done, whether it's paint stewardship that finally passed, looking at recycling and reusing paint. I'm currently working with MDE on scrap tire recycling. It's a big issue in my district, and especially in the city and actually around the state. People are dumping them. We don't know what to do with them. What do we do with them? How do we do with them? How do we properly dispose of them? Especially as electric cars are coming on and they're burning through tires a little bit more, looking at the engineering of it, but that waste ends up in our communities. I was honored what years is 2022, working with advocates to ensure that we actually had the definition of overburdened and underserved in the Climate Solutions Now Act legislation. And then most importantly, partnering with former delegates to put, for instance, trying to do a lot of work in the food waste disposal area and looking at school infrastructures and beginning that process and the infrastructure for kids to be able to start recycling and disposing of food and liquids in a way, because most schools have these projects and they're doing them in their schools. But one way we can start making those transitions for everybody to start doing this type of work is that we kind of train in school. And so that was one of those things. I am a member of the State's Commission on Environmental Justice and Statable Communities, where we have an opportunity to literally go to places where there are issues, whether it's places like Deal Island or Bellevue, communities, for instance, where historically Black communities live. Either there's a sea level or water rise issue on one hand, and on the other hand, access to water is being taken through development and blocking folks who usually just have access to waterfront property now doesn't have it. And so that has just been a little bit of my experience. I also, for the last 3 years, have introduced, brought by the community, environmental justice permitting bill that follows Delegate Melissa Wells' bill from 2022, HB 1200, that requires an environmental justice from the tool, a score on permits when they are given to or submitted to MDE, but trying to go a step further to give the state the ability to potentially, upon further evaluation because the score is not enough to potentially either ask for alterations or deny permits. And so that's been a little bit of my experience.
So much. And I just want to, that leads us into our next question really well, but I want to lift up a couple of things that you all said in your remarks, just to put a finer point on it. And that's, the health cost of climate change is significant and is being borne by the same overburdened and underserved communities that we've tried to put into law to invest in through Justice 40 initiatives. And so, and what we talk about, what we hear a lot about in the legislature when it comes to climate solutions is, well, how much is that going to cost? And I think what we're hearing is, there is a cost right now to the impacts of climate change. And it's not, I understand it's not apples to apples, but if we're not doing the math properly, it's going to look like solutions cost a lot more than they actually do because they're addressing a lot of problems on the back end that are caused by climate change. I appreciate that framing and talking about how climate change is impacting our health. And also I know it's come up in several other sessions, but the importance of the state of Maryland defining in law overburdened and underserved, because that's actually allowed us then this specificity in the definition is no longer, so that a lack of definition can't be an excuse for inaction, right? So when people say, well, what do you mean by that? Aha, I can point out to you in state law and now in corresponding mapping tools what I mean by that, so that we can invest in communities that have been identified in state law as overburdened and underserved. And so just lifting up a few things that were said and the importance and how we're seeing that play out and trying to advance legislation addressing environmental injustice. And so speaking of that, there have been attempts and efforts in the last 10 plus years to introduce environmental justice and cumulative impacts legislation, most of which have failed to pass. And you've all actually, including Delegate Taveras, sponsored versions of this legislation, with Senator Lamb sponsoring cumulative impacts bills in 2014, 15, 16, 17. Delegate Fraser Hidalgo, you have sponsored air quality monitoring legislation, trying to get sort of a local air quality sensors and networks in place. Delegate Taveras, who you heard from on the video, sponsoring Justice 40 legislation, so coming at it from that approach. And Delegate Boyce, you just mentioned sponsoring the most recent iteration of this EJ permitting legislation, because it is true in the state of Maryland, while we have this information and this mapping tool, the state departments do not have legal authority to make permitting decisions based on that information. So it's one thing to know, it's another thing to be empowered to take that action. They don't have the authority right now. So each of these efforts has faced unique opposition, and I just wanted to get your sense of what's ahead for environmental justice legislation with cumulative impacts legislation, knowing that we've tried for a long time to pass it, and there have been, sometimes there's this spurious economy versus environment argument. Sometimes there are questions about the categories of permits that should be included in legislation, subject to EJ review. And every time, there's a pivot, there's new opposition, there's new challenges. So just wanted to get your take on where this is going and what's the real opportunity to enact environmental cumulative impacts legislation in Maryland.
If I can, I'd like to start, if you don't mind, Dr. Senator and DFH. I think one of the biggest concerns and issues that I have is that when we do make progress, I think especially these two veterans know that, like, every year a bill doesn't pass, and speaking about my paint bill and some other bills that I had this year, took 5 years because I had to throw it in front of the General Assembly every year until, whether it was a tweak or two, some clarifications but sometimes I think when we put through bills time and time again, sometimes we cancel out momentum and then the bill dies. And so that's one issue. I think the other issue, going back to Rebecca's point about, we put in this definition, now we have something to point to. I think one of the issues with cumulative impacts is that the definitions are different among different environmental and advocacy communities. And so on one hand, someone is just talking about air pollution and somebody else is just talking about public health, but it is all of the quote unquote non-chemical and chemical stressors on the environment or on the person within that environment that creates quote unquote the cumulative impact. And so I think we can, pass something if we can agree on what it is, what it looks like in statute together to pass a bill. I think that would be great. I think one of the challenges right now, even with the EJ screening tool, is that people take it and say, well, here's this number, you can't do this, but it's not just the number, that's quantity, we're looking at quality. So what does that number say? What permits are within that area? What else is going on there? Who does live there? And when we talk about overburdened and underserved, look, the climate crisis affects us all. And while it disproportionately affects, quote unquote, underrepresented or Black and brown communities, sometimes we forget that it does affect us all and that we all have a stake in it above and beyond, quote unquote, underserved and overburdened communities. And so again, making it relevant to us all, one, two, making sure that together we have the appropriate definition to move forward with so that we don't get caught in some of the issues that I think, and again, we're one of 3 of 188 individuals, well, what do you mean by cumulative impacts? What are you trying to catch us on? Industry, quote unquote, gets caught up in like, well, if my number is 78, that means I can't get my permit. Like, so really trying to drill down and explain what this means and explain, most importantly, especially with the EJ permitting bill, is that this is just an indicator for us to take a look and take a second look if those numbers are quote unquote too high, to evaluate, to see if there is a harm or a greater harm that we're causing through these processes. So I think, again, it's a matter of between the environmental community coming up together saying that this is quote unquote, as we talk about cumulative impact, this is the definition that we're going to quote unquote use, because I think the different opinions and goals and priorities and definitions of that essential term has been some of the issue in my short tenure.
So I think that Delegate Boyce did a wonderful job of talking about cumulative impacts and where we are and how we need to move forward. And so a couple things. One is it is not unusual to take years and years and years to pass a bill. And the reason that Delegate Boyce was able to get her bill passed is because she has grit. She has grit. It's hard. It's hard to go before the legislature and have some of the same delegates ask the same question year after year, even when you've explained it to them year after year. It is very frustrating. And I will tell you that the 3 of us on the stage as legislators, and Rebecca will say the same thing, and you have to look at them straight in the face, and you have to be very nice, and you have to be very polite, even though in your head you are screaming, how do you not know this? We just talked about this. So with that said, I want to kind of move to the next part of the question, which is how do we get there, whether it's cumulative impacts or the work that I've worked on with air quality, or the fracking ban that Clarence and I were on the same committee and just trying to figure out how do we move this forward. That was a 3-year bill. It took 3 years. Worked with Rebecca on that as well. Worked with Senator Lamb, who was a delegate at the time. But Dr. Delegate, Dr. Senator, whatever, I dragged him up to the table with me. I'm like, Clarence, I need your help. And he goes, okay. So he starts doing all of his medical talk, which really, really helped in a lot of ways, because a lot of the folks were like, oh my God, I didn't understand all of that. So with that said, I think one of the really big issues right now is and Rebecca mentioned it before, and that is budget and money. So I think moving forward, we as legislators and as our partners in the crowd here, we have to figure out ways of generating revenue to offset the damage that has been done by fossil fuel companies and industry. And we must do that because we need those revenues to start to really address these issues. One of the biggest questions whenever we have a bill, before we actually sit down and we go talk to the chair or the vice chair about the bill, one of the very first things that comes out of their mouth is, oh, that sounds like a great idea. What's the fiscal note? What's the fiscal note? Because the Senate president and the speaker and the governor, everybody, how much is this going to cost? And that is a really big issue. So I think you'll see some bills. I have one of them that deals with how to raise that revenue, because we must raise the revenue in order to put forward policy, because these policies cost money to implement, and they cost a lot of money. And I think a lot of it is we have to figure out how to redirect zeros and ones from healthcare, which is going to be a while before we can do that, but understanding that we can move eventually those zeros and ones to preventative care and not need the health care, but people don't understand how to do that, and there's this big gap between when you can do that. So, you know, that old saying, a stitch in time saves 9, or an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. These are things we need to do. I will give you just a couple of very quick examples. The utility BG&E, their region, they need to generate a lot more electricity moving forward. So the PJM basically said, we need to build transmission lines into Pennsylvania to grab electricity off a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania to feed Maryland and the BG&E. And that's going to be close to $1 billion. $1 billion to build these transmission lines. If you take into account, in the state of Maryland, we buy electricity from outside of the state, and we spend $16 billion buying electricity from outside of the state. Most of our electricity in the state of Maryland comes from Calvert Cliffs Nuclear Power Plant. It's about 47%. Plus, we have our own goals with wind, and we have our own goals with solar, which we're moving toward, and we need to move toward them much more quickly. But to do that, we need the imagination to say, okay, well, maybe we don't spend $1 billion building power lines, transmission lines to Pennsylvania, when in the end, how long is that nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania going to be able to provide power to the state of Maryland? Because data centers are going to want to go there, and they're going to want to grab all the electricity out of that power plant. And so why are we building these power lines, right? But PJM says we have to build them, and we have to build them to some degree. But that money could go into solar, maybe not in that exact area wind, but it could go into a lot of solar and a lot of battery storage, home battery storage, utility battery storage, which then changes that formula. And maybe we don't have to spend all that money building transmission lines to another state. Maybe we can keep that money in the state of Maryland, which is where we should be doing that. A lot of the electricity that we buy is coming from West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio. It's all dirty. A lot of it is dirty electricity. So if you think about it, we're spending $16 billion to buy electricity from other states that are burning fossil fuels. Then the wind carries all those pollutants into the state of Maryland anyway. Then we have to pay for it in cumulative impacts and health-related issues. So it's a really, really vicious circle. And I think one of the ways that we have to break out of it is we have to figure out how to make those fossil fuel companies, make industry come to the table with money so we can make that transition, because that transition will pay massive dividends in the end, but the short term, that investment is billions and billions and billions of dollars.
All right, and agree with both their responses, very comprehensive and certainly identified a lot of the challenges. I'm going to take just a little bit of a different approach to, I think, the question about cumulative impacts, and I think there was some pre-conversation about this going on and why it's so difficult to get through the General Assembly. I think, you know, and open to hearing about their perspectives on this, I think the challenge from my perspective is now when you bring up cumulative impacts, there's enough that's been floated out there through legislation that a few of us have introduced over the years that I think a lot of our colleagues have this impression of cumulative impacts. I think the terminology also is just very abstract. And I think, you know, at this point, folks have an impression. It may or may not be accurate. A lot of our colleagues may not be the most informed about this issue. They hear about cumulative impacts, they start shutting down, right? People just like start zoning out. And so, you know, I think part of the solution, I think, is to probably come up with a new term, right? A term that better reflects the actual impact on the ground. I'm not the most creative person, so I don't have that term, but I think it would be incumbent on this community that really cares about this issue to come up with a different term for cumulative impacts, one that I think really conveys the actual direct impact that folks see on the ground, but allows you to start anew without all the baggage of what cumulative impacts people think that term means, and be able to start from scratch there, even though we know, what that means, and we know and have a sense of how that actually affects things. The second part of that, I think, is the other challenge, especially for a lot of us in this room, where we come from probably a data-oriented perspective or from science, is that a lot of our colleagues aren't necessarily making decisions from a science-oriented perspective or based on the best data or evidence. When we see folks come up with legislation during these hearings, they're oftentimes bringing constituents or people from their districts or lobbyists and whatnot that convey the stories about why this legislation is so important or what community is being impacted. And so would really encourage that you bring folks that can tell those anecdotes and tell those stories, especially the ones that are extreme, because that's what sticks in our colleagues' minds, that when they remember a bill, it's not about the details or the numbers or what the data or the evidence shows. Oh, do you remember that witness that said whatever? That was crazy, right? And so it's those stories that people really remember, that take back with them. And so while I know this audience is very evidence-based and data-driven, and we loathe to bring up folks that are just presenting anecdotes, because that might not actually reflect what we really ought to be doing from a policy perspective. But for all of you as advocates to find the folks that can actually bring the stories, the human impacts of these decisions, of these permitting and licensing decisions that are being made, so that they can share their stories, because that's what will resonate with our colleagues, in addition to a different name for cumulative impacts.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a lot to think about. I'm taking lots of notes. It's hard to moderate and then want to act on this stuff right away. But I think I have one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. So please, if there are any questions coming in from the virtual audience, please let me know. And we also have, I think, some mics to pass around the room after this next question. So we've started to talk about storytelling and the way that people can get involved during the legislative session to weigh in. But can you talk a little bit about sort of part A is how people can weigh in? What's the best way for people to weigh in during the session or on legislation? And then how you also seek that input as you're crafting legislation. How do you seek that input as well? There's always the hearing, and you can come testify and submit testimony. But we always hear about a hearing. You can't win your bill at the hearing. You can lose it, but it's one step in the process, and there's so much more involved. So yeah, how can people engage, and what are some sort of creative ways that you and your colleagues are reaching out to folks to get that input as you're crafting that legislation to sort of ensure that community voice is represented in that legislation?
Sure. I think what we forget, and what I remind our constituents when we're going to community meetings, is that session starts about a month or two after the last session. And so oftentimes we wait till December. It's like, I got this bill idea, or January. It's like, well, I want to file this bill. Honestly, that's just too late, because I've already lost the bill at that point. And so meeting in the interim with different groups and constituents about ideas and starting to do the research around it, coming up with those individuals that have those stories, helping them craft those stories in a way that tells about their experience, but in a way that legislators can hear and kind of glean from how they then kind of move forward with this bill. And so I always remind folks that it doesn't start at session, it starts before session. Who are your legislators? Who are the people that you need to reach out to on a committee? And often at times I would say, I don't think I'm that brilliant. I think my constituents are brilliant. So when we have a lot of these bills, it's because our constituents have brought them to us. An organization has brought them to us to to file on their behalf, and then we vet it and we bring the right people to the table to look at it to say, well, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that? And to a degree, depending on what it is, I'll go to a department and say, hey, we're doing this. We want to do it this way. What are your thoughts and what are your opinions? And sometimes, most of the times, they end up being, unlike the first 4 years I was in office, we have departments willing to step in and support legislation. So this past session, for instance, MDE did support the permitting bill because there was a new person in charge, and they were interested in doing having that permanent bill as an authority for the secretary. And so I think it goes both ways. You know, we're one individual who oversees thousands of individuals, and so we reach as far as we can. But on the other hand, too, I think I've been seeing, respectfully, I've been seeing certain lobbying firms kind of like working on behalf of advocates, and oftentimes those advocates are not the people that I see. And so when they come to me and say they're representing this particular community or this particular group, I say, well, I like to see the group, I like not to see you. Because, I mean, that's the point. If you're going to be an advocacy group and you're saying you're bringing certain people to the table, your job is to bring them to the table, and then you move out the way so that they can advocate for themselves. And so I've been kind of pushing that narrative a little bit more because I think it is. I don't think either one of these individuals would disagree with us. It is our job to meet with those individuals and those particular constituents to hear their stories firsthand. If you want to work to feel like you have to have the connection to then bring them to them, that's fine. But each individual, each constituent has a right and a responsibility and the permission to reach out to their own delegate, their own senator, and it is my responsibility, it is their responsibility, it is our responsibility to respond back.
So I think that I guess one of the best ways that I can kind of address the question is to kind of go back in time a little bit. Of all the bills that I passed, I think that one of the bills that I passed, which is probably the most recognizable to a community like this community, would be the fracking ban that I did. But it wasn't me, it was a bunch of people that helped to do this bill, and it took years to get this bill done. And again, with Rebecca and Clarence and so many people to get this bill done. But to Delegate Boyce's point, when this first came to me, it was an organizational group. They said, hey, we should, we're representing the idea of banning fracking in the state of Maryland. And we sat down and we chatted for a while. And I said, okay. And then they said, would you be interested in going on a trip to Pennsylvania to interview people that have had their land fracked on? I'm like, yeah, I'll do that. We did that. And then as we continued to build momentum, which took quite a bit of time, what we ended up doing is we passed a moratorium, which is just like, okay, no fracking for a couple of years until we can figure out the science, until we can figure out what this looks like in the state of Maryland. So in that period of time from the moratorium, it was, okay, we have to get the votes in the committee, we have to get the votes in the General Assembly, we have to convince everybody that this is a bad thing. At this point, from what I had seen, I already knew it was a really bad thing, but I needed a lot of help. So one of the things that this community did is it reached out to a bunch of people in Western Maryland where this fracking was going to happen. And they were all in on helping, and they did a lion's share of the work for me. So one of the things that I did is I drove out to Western Maryland and toured around and talked to them all around Deep Creek Lake. And they were just so passionate and so helpful that what we decided to do, which I ran by my chair, which is, hey, can we take a committee trip out to Western Maryland and see where the fracking would be? And in the meantime, the community's like, okay, we're going to help. We'll do a tour. What do we do? And I said, pick the most narrow road that you can, the most narrow mountain road where these sites would be sold, where there are already land deals in the works, and let's get the biggest bus and the most narrow road and put the committee on this bus and explain to them as they look down over the embankment down to the creek below, which went into Deep Creek Lake. Like sooner or later, one of those 500 truck trips, there was going to be an accident and thousands of gallons were going to leak everywhere. They were going to spill everywhere. Not to mention all these tiny little homes that were built in the 1930s and 40s on these tiny little roads with tiny little kids playing on those tiny front yards, thinking about these big trucks spewing out diesel fumes everywhere. Again, something Clarence helped me with, everywhere, thinking about these kids playing in these front lawns, and then all those diesel fumes making it into the houses, and the kids and the parents, you know, inhaling this minute after minute. So that's what we ended up doing. We ended up organizing the whole thing. We had a hearing out there. Everybody went on the bus. There were some folks on the other side of the aisle which were kind of on the fence, and one of them, and one of the delegates brought his daughter with him, and this is Andrew Castley. He brought his daughter with him for the trip, and she had just graduated from high school. She was a college student, so she was into like science and learning. And he's like, oh, I don't know if I can vote for this bill, DFH, I don't know. And then his daughter was there, and I remember her looking out of the window down that ravine, and she looked at her dad, and then I looked at him, and I'm like, you're voting for this bill? And he goes, yeah, I am. Yeah. So, but I couldn't have done any of that if the community, to the point the community didn't know which roads roads already had land contracts on, where this was going to happen. They rented the bus. They did all of that. They helped us. And then we had a big hearing where, you know, a couple people came and talked about how they wanted to frack their land and wanted to make a bunch of money. And a majority of the community were like, no, we don't want our land fracked. We don't want to destroy Deep Creek Lake. We don't want to destroy Western Maryland. We don't want to destroy kids' lungs. We don't want, you know, methane and gas leaking everywhere. So it really was working with the community more than it was working with us. The bill would have never passed if the community didn't help guide us through the process and help teach everybody on that committee what this was really going to look like, not on paper, not in a committee hearing room in Annapolis, but right there on the ground. So I would say that is a really, really big piece. We can't do that by ourselves. We don't know how, and we don't have the resources.
I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach and try to convey to you a different tool that you can use as well that oftentimes is not one of the first tools that folks would reach for. I think I may be the only one up here that served on one of the budget committees. I served for 2 years on the House Appropriations Committee. And bring that up because there are ways to be able to insert things into the budget that could also help your issues and your causes as well. And oftentimes people overlook them because everyone always reaches for the legislation tool, right? We're legislators, we all love to reach for legislation, but there are other tools in the budget that you can use to help either put guardrails in place, put limitations in place, and also be able to help advance your issue or cause for future sessions as well. I'll use this example. Those of you who live near BWI Airport, and I've got Howard County in my district, a lot of concerns with some of the airport noise that's coming through because of how takeoffs and landings are reconfigured around BWI Airport over the last like 8 years or so. And so there was also a lot of concern about how all of that airport noise was impacting people's environmental health, that it was causing people to lose sleep at night, it was causing them to miss work, et cetera, et cetera. And so myself and another delegate had filed legislation to ask the state to study the health impacts of airport noise from BWI. And you know, this was fought against by the administration. The Hogan administration at the time did not want to see this go through, et cetera, et cetera. The bill was really on dire straits. But we were able to work with the budget committees to, even though the bill didn't pass, the bill didn't advance, there was funding in the budget to be able to support that study, and that flew under the radar. And so that was included in that year's budget. The study was done, and that actually allowed us then to work off of the results of that study, that it showed, you know, real health impacts, millions of dollars of health impacts on families in kind of the Anne Arundel, Howard County areas, to be able to support legislation that we just passed last year to increase the size of the Maryland Aviation Commission so that we can include people that have expertise in health on the Aviation Commission that governs BWI Airport, so that when it comes to these decisions about expanding the airport and bringing more flights in and reconfiguring the runways, that it's not just an economic-based decision, because everyone wants to see the airport do well, but it has to be balanced against the real environmental impacts, the health impacts, and the other community impacts that take place. And so think about those other tools that you can use in the budget, because oftentimes that's another way to be able to achieve your goals without having to reach for the legislative tool that all of us like to reach for initially.
Just very quickly to follow up on something that Delegate Boyce said that I wanted to really expand upon, and that is that now is the greatest time if you have ideas and you want to come up with ideas and try to push them forward. Now is the greatest time to do that, because all of us have worked on a previous administration where the question wasn't, the answer wasn't no, or we'll think about it. The question was, thanks for telling us. Now we're going to quietly in the background do everything we can to figure out how to crush your bill and sink your bill. Now with the new administration, that's not the answer. The answer is, okay, how can we do this? Where can we find the money? What can we do? How does this work? And for the very first couple of meetings, and I don't know about my colleagues up here, but one of the very first meetings in my office with the new administration, the Moore administration, somebody from the Department of Environment came in, and I was like, why don't you want to pass this bill? I was like loaded I was ready to fight. And they're like, we do want to pass the bill. We have some ideas. And I was like, oh, wait a second. It was really crazy, because for so many years, we have been like just geared. We have been trained to just fight. And the great thing about this administration is it's not fight. It's like, okay, how can we do it? We can't always do everything we want to do, but the initial thought is, how do we get there, not how do we sink it? So now's your time to now it's a lot easier than it was.
And one other example just that ties in, I think, a couple things that folks said was that, so when electric school buses is another, a really good example. So the organization I work for, the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, has a Latino outreach program called CHISPA. And through that work, a lot of promotoras in our program were saying, my kid has asthma, they take the bus every day, they're the same height as the tailpipe, and I think this pollution source is hurting them. And so this idea for clean buses, healthy niños, and trying to get transitioning to electric school buses is a community-driven idea from the CHISPA program, and we've worked on legislation sponsored by Hidalgo, and also on some budget language to make sure there's money in the budget, so that, because the upfront cost for electric school buses is higher. The lifetime cost isn't necessarily higher, but that upfront cost. So what could we do to make sure there was some funding in the budget, and then make sure school districts know about it and it gets distributed? We're working on that part. But making sure that there's money in the budget so that when this legislation passes and says, hey, school districts, you have to switch to electric school buses for all these good reasons to protect children's health, we work to make sure that there's some financial support to help you do that. And so I think that's another good example that ties in community engagement, community originated ideas, and making sure there's money in the budget to do it.
5-year bill.
Yeah, 5 years. So it's a long time. This work is a marathon, not a sprint. You know, Dr. Wilson started the day with 40 years ago. Like, we're talking, people are here today who have been working on this for decades, if not been in the works for centuries. And I think, this, and similarly, the work that's being reflected on the federal level through Justice 40 and some of the bills that are passing along the state level, it's all because of this. One bill might take several years, but the work is decades long. And so we're seeing that honored, in a lot of the legislation today. Gonna turn it over to you all. And if someone from the Siege team wants to grab Dr. Wilson, I know as we conclude in a little bit, he wanted to transition everybody to this evening's celebration. So just want to make sure he's in the room for that. But who has questions? We have a mic in the back, and we have some questions over here. And if there are online questions, please let me know, and we'll try to get to those as well. Yeah, Shashwanda, go ahead. Try again, because I think I want the people online to hear you too. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, we can hear you.
I wrote my question down, so I won't go off script. First, my question is, are you guys familiar with the CXX coal terminal that's in Curtis Bay that operates within 1,000 feet of the rec center? And do you know if it's considered by the state of Maryland a major or a minor pollution source?
I think first, yes, for the first question, I do know. Second, I am not sure if it's considered minor or major. My first thought is that MDE might consider it a minor. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's definitely considered a minor. And I think that's what the problem is. And most of the EJ communities, like in Curtis Bay, which is like one of the #1 EJ communities, most of the polluting sources are considered minor sources. And so we have definitely talked a lot about those cumulative impacts and how we actually get a bill to address those things. But I think a lot of the times it's a bill that we want to see community-led so it can actually address a lot of these issues. And so I guess the next question would be, is that something that you guys are willing to do to allow communities to take lead on a cumulative impact bill and support that?
I don't think I understand the question. What's the question?
So the question is, are you guys, are you in agreement with communities taking the lead on cumulative impact bills? And would you guys support that if that is lifted forward by communities?
I think a community can take a lead on any bill that they want. I don't, you know, that's, yeah.
Yeah, but the question is, would
Well, it
you
depends
guys
on what it
support that?
says. Absolutely. Happy to work with the community if that is something they're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Additional questions? So yes, community-led, community input and community-led legislation, particularly when you are trying to address specific issues. And I know, in Curtis Bay, there, like you just mentioned, a lot of minor sources. So how do we get legislation that makes, because, again, through legislation, what MDE needs in legislation is the authority to make decisions on a permit based on environmental justice information. It currently does not have that authority. So when there is an area like Curtis Bay where there are multiple sources of pollution and we are still in a permitting process where the authority exists that each facility gets permitted one at a time, it's not taking into effect that cumulative the impact. And that's sort of inherently understood, I think, by folks on the stage, but until there's more education, I think we've talked about education with your colleagues, and education, sort of getting that into the definition and allowing MDE to make decisions based on that information. We're still in this cycle. So is it, what are really how can we get at that in legislation and ensuring that it's community led? So appreciate that discussion. Additional questions or anything online? I'll be shocked if there's no question. Is this the end of the day? Nobody has questions?
I think we have some online.
There is an online.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so
I could ask these folks a million questions, but just to be clear, well, go ahead.
Tony Green asks, what benefits exactly qualify under the 40% of which needs to be allocated to disadvantaged communities under Justice 40?
Can you read the first part again?
What benefits exactly qualify under the 40% of which needs to be allocated to disadvantaged communities under Justice 40?
So if I can start with an example maybe, and then, a good example of how we saw that program get implemented in Maryland state law was actually a bill that was passed in 2024. So right now it's, the federal executive order says 40% of the benefits of environmental programs, and I think it's been discussed yesterday and through sessions today, doing the math on that, like what does 40% of the benefits mean and how are we allocating that? It's a great question. In the state of Maryland, when we have been trying to implement Justice 40 in state law, it's looked like a couple different things. In 2024, there was a bill that passed. There's an existing program called the Comprehensive Flood Management Grant Program. There was a piece of legislation that passed this year that increased the amount of money that can go to that program and said at least 40% of that funding should go to projects in or directly benefiting communities that are overburdened or underserved. So it's, I think, a really eloquent application of Justice 40. Here's a program that we know is important, that's overextended every single year, and we want to make sure that 40% gets allocated to overburdened underserved. Our community solar law, it was a pilot program and now it's permanent. When the permanent law went into place, it said that at least 40% of the energy created by community solar programs should go to low to moderate income households, because we know that community solar, subscribing to community solar saves you money every month on your energy bill. So we're saying that community solar should be made available to low to moderate income households. So there isn't like a blanket. So Delegate Tavares started to talk about some of the accountability measures we can put into place to make sure, to see what kind of benefits are out there and how we can make sure 40% are allocated. You know, there was a report that came out at the end of last year. MDE consulted with a group at the University of Maryland to try to see, of the greenhouse gas spending in the state of Maryland, is 40% going to be invested in overburdened underserved communities. They had to create a methodology to figure out, how do we know where our greenhouse gas emissions reduction spending is going. So they're looking at the GHG emissions reduction spending. Community solar and comprehensive flood management grant program, I think, are two other examples. And Delegate Tavares is going to work on this legislation that sort of takes that broader view and tries to create that accountability and that accounting for the Justice 40. So I don't know if you had, I just wanted to, I think those are some good examples. Okay. Anything, other questions? Yeah, Abby, I think in the back.
Thank you. Wonderful to hear you all speak and to see you. Thank you so much for the work that you've done. My question for each of you is, what do you think is the most important thing to get passed this year in terms of emissions reduction, like fighting climate change? What do you think is the most important thing that needs to be done this year in terms of environmental justice? Are they the same thing or are they two different things? There you go.
I think we need money. I think we have a climate solutions now bill that we have not fully implemented. I mean, Delegate Fraser Hidalgo and I are on the same work group for just transitioning. I mean, it's 2024. And so I think in order for communities to be able to see legislation in action, we need the money to be able to start getting through these studies and getting through these works so that we can get back the information so we can start implementing this. So right now, I think budget is important, because if we don't have the money to fully implement the priorities that we passed, you know, communities are going to look at us and say, well, you said you were doing this thing. You said that these were your priorities, and now we don't have the money. So for me, and I guess I'll speak for myself, I'd like to make sure we can find the type of revenue that certainly doesn't overtax and overfee our residents now, but in a way that meets our priorities to be able to fully implement this, to ensure that we still fund education, the blueprint for Maryland's future, finding a way where we can, I know Delegate Phaedra Hidalgo has done this, we're losing highway user revenue, which doesn't meet our transportation needs. And so what are we doing to meet those transportation goals that we're not fully meeting now because we don't have the money? And so it stinks to say that money rules, but money rules right now. And so that is, I think, where a lot of the legislature is going to put its head, because the executive is going to make some suggestions that, and I can only speak for the House, I know the House is going to fight because our priorities are important. And so, you know, you got to put your money where your priorities are, and we're working to figure out how we budget and find or have creative ideas about funding so we can fund these priorities, so you can start seeing that we have put these things in place and that these are our priorities, your priorities that we want you to start seeing manifest.
So funny you should ask that question. And since you opened the door, I'll just go ahead and I'll just walk right through it. I had a bill for the last couple of years, and I have a bill again this year called the Renew Act. And what it essentially does is it allows the Attorney General of the state of Maryland to sue the fossil fuel companies. Right now, the Attorney General cannot do that without a change in the law. So that would result in about $1 billion a year for about 9 years, so $9 billion, which would go a very long way in implementing a lot of the climate solutions. Now, policies that we've put forward, a lot of what we've mentioned, a lot of the things that are important to you. And I know that Delegate Stein also has a bill to generate some revenue, so there are some revenue bills coming. The question is making sure that we can take advantage of them. I will tell you, for the Renew Act, a couple of states did it last year. They've been working on it for a few years, and they passed. So often what happens in the General Assembly, besides what's the fiscal note, is, are there any other states doing this? And now we can answer yes. So I will be personally pushing that bill as hard as I can, because the way I look at it, that is, it's not free money, because we've already paid for it. We're paying for it with emergency room visits. We're paying for it with stormwater management issues. We're paying for it with bronchial-related issues. We're paying for it in so many ways, so many externalities in which we're paying for it already. So we're just, trying to get some of that money back to cover our cost. And I use this bill as akin to, present this bill as akin to the tobacco industry. They knew for decades that this was causing cancer, and they did it anyway. And the fossil fuel industry has known for decades that what happens, and they did it anyway. So, yeah, exactly. So they should pay for it, and we should make them, and it's owed us.
I'll just close with kind of this reflection on things too. That oftentimes, as was pointed out earlier, many of us are looking at the fiscal note first, especially our colleagues, right? So when every bill comes in with a fiscal note saying how much this is going to cost the state, when it comes to public health measures, when it comes to good environmental health, there are oftentimes upfront costs that all of you know that will pay dividends in the end, right? So from a healthcare perspective, expanding the state's Medicaid program, does it cost more? Yes. Will we prevent more chronic disease? Yes. Will we save money in the end? Yes. But all the fiscal note shows is just the upfront cost. And so I think it's incumbent on all of you to really help point out the fact that this is an investment. These programs are investment. These services are investment. Investing in electric buses is an investment. But that'll mean less cases of asthma in the future, right? Less cases that will cost us more in Medicaid through the state's Children's Health Insurance Program and others. And so, it's really important for our colleagues to hear that from advocates like yourself, because oftentimes they'll be staring at a big number in that fiscal note, and it's sometimes very difficult to overcome that. And being able to provide us that information, be able to arm our colleagues with how this will actually save money to the state in the end, and have the data and the evidence to show it, is really, really important, because the next couple of years, as you can hear, are going to be very tight budget years. They're going to be very, very tight budget years. And I know the House has a different approach, but the Senate is probably not looking at revenue increases. And so we're kind of making do with what we have. And my guess is the administration doesn't want to look at revenue increases either. So we're kind of stuck where we're at for the next couple of years, at least until the next election, 2026.
So what I'm hearing is we need all of you to come to Annapolis and tell your stories and help, in this tight budget year, to make sure that as legislation passes, that it uses an equity and EJ lens, and that your stories are really what are going to move elected officials, because that's the piece that sticks with you, and that's really where we kind of started the day. So it's nice to end the day that way. And please, please, please join me in giving a warm thank you to our panelists here. Thank you for being here. It sounds like there's some celebrations coming up in a little bit, so I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Wilson to let you know what's next on the agenda for this evening, and I'll see you there.
Thank you. Excellent panel. Great to see folks on the stage talking about, legislation in the future and also investments, right? So first I'm gonna give a shout out to those who are watching virtually. We had some issues with some AV today. We're working hard to make sure we don't have those issues for tomorrow. So I just want to say that real quick. But we are going to have a celebration. As Rebecca said, we have an evening cultural event and dinner. I know this has been a long day for folks on stage today. Again, appreciate y'all closing us out. But we're going to have a cultural event and dinner. It starts at 7 o'clock, so you get a little bit of break. We're going to have art. There's basically an art gallery across the hallway, y'all. So there's art, justice-focused art. There's going to be dancing. There's going to be music. There's going to be basically just a lot of great things that are going to happen. So please thank our closing panel again for all their great words and the great work that they're going to be doing this legislative session coming up, working on EJ issues and equity issues. Also give yourself a round of applause for being here all day. This is a long event. Okay, and again, please go take a break, and you're going to be amazed and wowed by the art gallery and the cultural event that's going to start promptly at 7 o'clock. And thank you for those of you who are online who are able to survive the online issues, and we'll see you again tomorrow morning. Take care. Everybody.